For those of you who know this song really well, you'll notice that we made a cut and took out a little bit more graphic pieces. But the essence is there. Alexander Hamilton meets Maria Reynolds. And that's when he began to pray, Lord, show me how to say no to this. I don't know how to say no to this. Alexander Hamilton finds himself in a predicament of his own creation. He had poured all of his energies into the establishment of a stable federal government under the new United States Constitution. His latest project is the creation of a national banking system that would stabilize the finances of the fledgling republic. His wife, Eliza, is concerned that he's overworked and wants him to join the family at her father's summer home in upstate New York. But Hamilton resists, citing his workload and the need to find a way to get the banking system's legislation passed and through the Congress. In the end, Eliza and their children head to the country, leaving Alexander alone in the city. Now, without the moderating influence of his family around him, he plunges into his work without regard for what we would call good self-care and work-life boundaries or balance. He is trouble waiting to happen. I hadn't slept in a week. I was weak. I was awake. You never seen a bastard orphan more in need of a break, longing for Angelica, missing my wife. And that's when Miss Maria Reynolds walked into my life. It is a reality of being human that when we run ourselves down, our emotional, physical, and spiritual resources become exhausted. And as a consequence, we compromise our ability to make good decisions. Too late, Alexander realizes the position he's put himself in. Too late, he understands that he has compromised himself with Maria Reynolds, the woman he's met in his wandering. That's when I began to pray, Lord, show me how to say no to this. I don't know how to say no to this. Let me be clear here. Alexander Hamilton has gotten himself into trouble. We need to be careful not to fall into the age-old trap of dismissing male behavior by saying that he was seduced. Maria tempted him, and he was unable to resist her seduction. No, Hamilton is responsible for his own behavior. It is his decisions, his actions that led to the month-long affair. He has created the cause of his own predicament by working crazy hours without sleep. Hamilton has made himself vulnerable, and he's compromised his ability to make clear-eyed, clear-headed decisions. I don't know how to say no to this. Lord, show me how to say no to this. And that has reminded us of Jesus teaching his disciples to pray this petition in the Lord's Prayer. Do not bring us to the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one. Many of us have been taught the version of this prayer that says, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. We understand because we have been taught that interpretation of the prayer to mean that God can lead us into temptation. But that's not the essence of what Jesus was teaching the disciples or us. That is why in the New Revised Standard Version, which we read from this morning, it uses the words, "Do not bring us to the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one." As a matter of fact, no less an authority than Pope Francis had the following to say when he redirected or directed a revision of the Lord's Prayer in 2017 and spoke of it on television. He was referring to the petition, "Lead us not into temptation." And he said, "It is not a good translation because it speaks of a God who induces temptation. I am the one who falls. It's not God pushing me into temptation to then see how I have fallen. A father doesn't do that. A father helps you to get up immediately. It is Satan, the evil one, who leads us into temptation. That's his department." Subsequently, Pope Francis approved the revision of the prayer to read, "Do not let us fall into temptation." You see, our prayer is more in the nature of, "God, help me, assist me, that I'm able to avoid putting myself into circumstances where I come to a time of temptation. Help me to maintain healthy boundaries and good habits of ethical and moral behavior. Help me to resist and push back if I find myself tempted. Give me the strength and courage to avoid leaving myself vulnerable when I'm emotionally, physically, and spiritually run down, when I'm unable to resist temptation on my own. Help me." An important element that we should not miss here is the importance of our relationship with God, of having a regular prayer life. When Jesus teaches his disciples to pray, it is with the understanding that the disciples pray not just daily, but it is their habit to pray several times a day. It is in a steady relationship with God and Jesus Christ that we build our spiritual lives and we develop a deep inner well of resources to help us resist times of trial and temptation. If we don't have that habit, if we neglect that relationship with God, we have nothing to fall back on. How can we expect to rely on God's strength or ask for God's help if we don't know God? What Jesus was teaching his disciples is that God is relational, not transactional. We need to work on our relationship. Spend time with God. Talk to God. And then Jesus says, God will hear us. Temptation, coming to a time of trial, is the place where our character is tested. That is the time we need a relationship with God. And in this instance, Alexander Hamilton is unable to resist temptation. Later in the musical, we find he admits that after his affair is made public and after the death of his son, he finds himself praying and he says, I've never done that before. Throughout history, the church has so often focused much of its attention on sins or temptations of a sexual nature. But that's not just the only sin that leads us to temptation. There is a whole panoply of ways we can find ourselves needing God's help. For one, the corrosive and corrupting influences of money and power that are so pervasive in our American culture in the year 2020. Simply look at the vast sums of money that are solicited by candidates for political office at all levels of government in this country. Or what about the monies that flow through the various forms of lobbying organizations in order to buy time with elected officials and buy their support for and influence in creating legislation that favors the particular lobbying group or lobbyist? Lord, do not bring us to a time of trial or temptation, but rescue us from the evil one. During this time of severe pandemic and serious economic upheaval, many are no doubt praying, keep us from circumstances where I am tempted, because I need food to feed my family, or I cannot find a job that will pay me enough that I can afford this month's and next month's rent. My spouse, my children, my parents need health care, and we don't have the money to pay for a visit to the doctor's office, or to pay for the medications that the doctor will prescribe, or to pay the premium on the health insurance that we need, that is due because I lost my job and I no longer have health insurance. Those of us that are privileged to live with enough and more than enough most often do not recognize or understand the stresses and the strains of living in poverty and what it forces people to do, to make ends meet, to pay for what they need. Yet, Jesus recognized most often those who were living in that deep need on the margins of our societies. Lord, keep us from the temptation to look at others as less than we are. Help us to remember that we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. Help us to remember that our neighbors, including our Black, brown, and Asian neighbors, have as much right to a home to live in, a well-paying job, a quality education for themselves and their children, access to affordable quality health care, and the right to become a citizen of this nation and vote as we do. Help us to resist the temptation to set ourselves apart or above our neighbors. Rescue us, gracious and holy God, from ourselves. Or as the hymn we are about to sing says in the second verse, when in our vain pretensions we conspire to shape God's image as we see our own, hark, listen to the voice above our base desire. For our God is the sculptor, we are the fashioned stone. Amen.